I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. Hey, welcome back. We're going to talk about PMS today, and I want to give you some intel because I don't think that treating your PMS should be that difficult, and it definitely shouldn't feel expensive. Now, before we jump in and talk about treating your PMS on a budget, I do want to acknowledge that the number one stressor in most people's lives is financial, especially in this climate. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert at Canadian or US financials in this moment. However, I think all of us understand and realize that there are particular financial pressures at play right now, that this is something that is top of mind for many people. And so as we talk about this conversation, PMS on a budget, I don't want it to come across as absolutely tone deaf, because it's not. The purpose of this conversation is that you may have some of the resources you already need inside of you to feel better from a PMS perspective, and you can do those things for free. I want to talk about that. I also want to acknowledge that your stress and your PMS are incredibly intertwined. And so even though we're looking for, some free solutions on how to support that hormonal health, we have to acknowledge that people's deep-rooted financial distress is going to play a role in their hormonal health and in the way that they feel. And that is important. We just need to call that out. So I didn't want to gloss over that particular piece. And I think if you acknowledge that in yourself, that over the last, I don't know, when was the last time they raised interest rates in Canada? The last 6 to 9 months have not been pretty, especially for my Canadian audience. And if you've noticed that your hormonal health feelings or your hormonal symptoms have escalated over time as your financial stress has increased over time, that is not a coincidence. Okay, so we're going to talk through some free solutions today to your PMS, but let's just acknowledge that if you're not feeling quite like yourself and you're experiencing more financial distress than you've maybe experienced before, it's hard for us to separate those two things. But I did want you to have some solutions, and these solutions do not cost anything. I see that as a win, but I don't want to gloss over the fact that your actual deep distress is probably one of the things that's putting the most pressure on your PMS. So we'll call that out. PMS does ebb and flow with time, with life stressors, with age, and interestingly, if you've never been someone who's been particularly PMSy, and as you cross that bridge into your 40s, you suddenly develop a lot of PMS-related symptoms, we may want to start calling that perimenopause. We may want to start to flag that as perimenopause. The actual definition of perimenopause involves your menstrual cycle changing, although I'm going to make a prediction here. I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to start to widen some of that discussion on perimenopause, because people can have relatively consistent menstrual cycles and still be experiencing some differences in their hormonal release under the surface. That is because of perimenopause. So right now, the full definition means you have to have changes to your actual menstrual cycle, the number of days in between each bleeding episode. My guess is we're going to see some change in that definition over the next decade as we start to acknowledge that people can start to have hormonal changes even though their menstrual cycle remains stable. But if you've suddenly developed PMS in your 40s, this conversation is still important for you. I'm just acknowledging that we might call it something a little different. But for many people, they have a symptom of PMS, or they've had multiple, or there's phases of their life where they've experienced PMS and then maybe phases where they haven't. There's actually over 150 symptoms that have been connected with PMS. Not all of those are super distressing, right? Like we can have some like mild changes to how we feel that aren't necessarily pathological or distressing. And I think it's common sort of in the wellness space that we make people so hyper aware of their cycles that they now notice if they like urinate an extra time during their period, or if they have a little bit of a change in their sleep quality during their luteal phase, and they worry about those things. They're actually probably fine. Like they're not causing a problem. It's just a reflection of the fact that people who ovulate and menstruate don't feel the same way every day. But there are over 150 symptoms that have been chalked up to PMS. Although for you listening, the ones that I would say are the most prominent or the most distressing are the mood-related changes, specifically irritability, more emotional fragility, depressive-like feelings, maybe some anxiety, and then some of the more physical symptoms, like breast tenderness, bloating, etc. We're mostly going to talk about the mental emotional symptoms today, but interestingly, if you put some of these pieces into practice, your physical symptoms will also get better, especially the last two that I want to talk about. They do have a big impact on your physical symptoms. So at this point of the game, I think most people are tracking their cycles in some way, or at least they've had enough knowledge to think about the different phases of their menstrual cycle, those kind of sort of 4 weeks, and recognize that they maybe don't feel quite the same at each phase. Now, I'll tell you, when I began practicing, that piece of information was like mind-blowing for people. This was not common knowledge. Nobody tracked their cycle. We would ask them when the first day of their last menstrual cycle was, and they would look at us like, oh my God, I have no idea. Like a decade ago, even though I started practicing more than a decade ago, this was not like common knowledge. I am incredibly grateful that we have this as common knowledge right now. So I'm going to skip over the part where you should track your symptoms because I'm sure that you already know that by now. Lots of great apps, lots of great devices now that you can wear. I personally wear an Oura Ring, and I've actually talked about that in another podcast on wearables to track my basal body temperature. And although the tracking apps are fine, there's research on the tracking apps, and interestingly, if your cycle is not regular, like it deviates from that 28 days, those apps are not that accurate at predicting when your period's going to come and when you ovulate. So food for thought on that if your cycle is a little bit outside of that textbook 28 days. And sometimes those apps will have you track so many symptoms that you start to line up, symptoms that, again, maybe aren't distressing or aren't problematic, but you line them up with your cycle. I'm always curious about that. Like if you wake up in the morning and your phone is like, dude, you're going to cry today. Like, does that increase our likelihood of crying if your app is like, whoa, 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 like, watch out. This is a day that you're not going to feel your best. I'm always interested in that and sort of mindful of that. And in my opinion, some of the menstrual tracking apps do go a little bit above and beyond from a symptom tracking perspective. And I don't know if like all news is good news, right? As far as us paying attention to those hormone symptoms. But the first strategy that I'm going to suggest when it comes to supporting your own PMS, and really there's a couple of themes here that we're going to talk about. Like one is trying to recognize it in the moment and also to talk about it with the people in your life. And we're going to talk about how to do that. We're going to talk about, your vices, right? So the things that you tend to fall back on when you're stressed or when you're fatigued, etc., and how they might actually be worsening your PMS. We're going to talk about sleep. We're going to talk about exercise and the actual research on those things. But the first thing I really suggest is trying to hold your own PMS out at arm's length when it's happening so that you can recognize this feeling and this experience. It's really common for me to work with women who, when I ask them what their goals are, they burst into tears. And then secondly, they say, I'm not the fill in the blank, whatever their major life identity role is, whether it's mother or partner. I'm not the mother partner that I want to be all the time. And those people may identify as happy, happy-go-lucky, fun, funny, adventurous, patient, kind, generous, except during PMS, where they identify as being short and irritable and have no patience and no tolerance. And don't you dare turn that radio on while you're also chewing at the same time, because it makes my brain want to explode. And that's hard. It's hard to feel like you don't get to show up as yourself. And I can talk about this pretty deeply because I actually have pretty sizable PMS myself. It's hard to not show up as the person you want to be, or as the person that you just are, right? Like if the other part of the month you just are more fun and nicer, it's hard to watch yourself show up as this irritable person. And the reason I make that suggestion around holding it out at arm's length, and we talk about this with our mental health patients as well, that it helps you actually see it for what it is in that moment, right? It's a reaction that you're having. It isn't you as your core person, right? So when you're saying that in your head, like, I don't want to be this mom, like you aren't, right? Hold it out in front of you and say, when this is happening to me, it makes it hard for me to be patient. Not I am a terrible person, right? It's a huge difference. But when you get to hold it out at arm's length, you also can start to slow down some of your responses and slow down some of that experience so that you can try and just see the world through the lens of like, I'm having a hard time and this scenario is going to be hard for me. Versus, when we run through scenarios at 100 kilometers an hour and you realize you just swore at your partner, even though like you didn't really mean it. And now that you're thinking about it, you have a ton of remorse about it. We have to slow down some of those conversations and experiences and try and see it through the lens of like, this is hard for me right now. I know for myself, like I'm a very analytical person. For myself, when I have a lot of PMS, I struggle managing assertive communicators because it feels like an attack, right? And that's one of the things that happens with PMS is that we're actually not as capable as reading the room. We're not as capable at interpreting tone, although I'm never that great at the tone of people that are super assertive. But when I have PMS, it's even worse, right? And so I, even for myself, have tried to be like, how can I recognize that this person is just an assertive communicator versus they hate me, right? And so for me, I've started to recognize that like, wow, those sentences are short. They didn't even sign their email with their own name, right? Like I can see it in the structure of the email that this person's communication style will be hard for me in this moment. I'm going to leave it unread. Or I'm going to like maybe delegate it away or raise my hand at a team meeting and say, I'm not sure I can write that response this week because it's hurting my feelings and I'm not sure they meant it that way, but I can't respond. And so for me, I've had to hold it like so far out in front of myself to be like, when people are really assertive and I have PMS, how can I recognize that that's happening in the moment rather than me bursting into tears, assuming everybody hates me, writing back this like super analytical and emotional response and being like, you didn't even sign your name. No, I have to like hold it 6 feet out in front of me and say, okay, this is what's actually happening, Jordan. Your response to it is heightened, but what's actually happening is this. And so try it, right? Like try holding some of those scenarios out in front of you and trying to look at them from a slightly different perspective or lens. And I know it's hard because you don't even, if we're not aware or it's like catching us off guard, we might not even be prepared to talk about how you let pistachio shells get into the dishwasher, catcher. You may not even know that that's coming, right? And so it will be hard to recognize it in the moment. But where you can, right? Email's a great example of that because we do not have to respond right away. I don't know if anyone's told you. There are some moments where you can slow down your response and slow down. And when you feel yourself having those feelings in that PMS week, be like, whoa, okay, stop. What is happening? Can I see this as clearly as I want to in this moment? And what can I do differently in order to get a better outcome of this? Because I want to show up as a leader. I want to show up with love. My initial reaction is to freak out. Can I change this? Right? That's my recommendation. The other thing that happens when we hold our mental emotional symptoms out in front of us is that it helps us recognize that we're not going to feel like this forever. And that is a huge turning point in feeling about your feelings and feeling about your mental health, is if you can say to your feelings or your emotions, I probably won't feel like this next week. Or I know this is going to get better. Or today is probably the worst of the week. I can see that, but I know that this isn't me, right? Those sayings and having that confidence actually will help you navigate, and it will help you make better decisions about some of the other things we're going to talk about. But if you can't slow it down and hold it out in front of you to say, this is my PMS talking, then you have an extra glass of wine, maybe an extra cup of coffee. You don't go to bed early enough. You doomsday scroll like friends that have left your life profile, which like, let's just not do that. And you respond to emails when you shouldn't, and you take everything really sensitively. Whereas if you can hold it out in front of you, you get to start to parent yourself a little bit and say, I got to go to bed. I can see this. This is not working for me. I got to go for a walk. If I have another cup of coffee, my brain is going to explode. But you only get there if you can look at it a bit more objectively and slow that whole thing down. The other piece that goes quite well with this is actually communicating with the people you love and the people around you what's happening to you or what's happening in you. My husband always jokes when I have PMS. He's like, it's the day that you don't want to be married. And we actually will use humor. And I've talked about this in other episodes, but I think it's actually still pretty relevant, that when you tell your person or your partner, what it feels like to be PMSy, but also give them some ideas on how they can help you short circuit it, it can go a really long way in helping you navigate those toughest days of the month. For us, it's humor, right? For us, it's my husband being like so silly that I can't be annoyed anymore because he's just so silly, right? Or joking about my sensitivity, or joking about like, this is the day that I'd like him to move out. That helps us. That helps me. I've always considered it a bit of a short circuit in my brain for that PMS experience. But when you can tell your partner that you're feeling more sensitive or that you're having a harder time, it helps them understand why you're, mixing your eggs so aggressively, right? It helps them. It helps them also know that it's not them, right? And that it's just the day. And it may help them help you because they can see you maybe making some decisions for yourself that are not helping you, like skipping the gym or not making your lunch or something like that. And they can help you by taking care of you during that time. So I think it's really important to tell your partner. I also think it's really important to tell your coworkers, especially if you work in a collaborative environment such that things can be done by multiple people, So you just take turns passing things to each other when you don't feel like doing it. But also it can help you contextualize with them the speed at which you're working, what you need help with, but also it will help you help them manage some of your work or even edit some of your work, right? And I've definitely passed off emails to people and been like, is this too bitchy? Like, this, try and read this and imagine that I'm like happy and not PMSy. Am I using the wrong tone? Because it helps, right? Because I'm not showing up as a grouchy kind of short person, especially if I can get some help from someone else to help me manage my communication. So I think those two sort of go together, because one, if you are going to hold it out in front of you and be like, this is my PMS talking, you might as well just tell the person that you live with, right? Or help them understand what's happening with you. It also helps both of you recognize that it's not going to be like that forever and that it's not really a choice, right? It's not a choice. And so that can be so freeing to help you get the level of sensitivity and compassion and care that you need during those couple of days if the person who cares about you the most understands how difficult it is. But I do think many women, either A, they have never tried to articulate it, so their partner does not know what it feels like, or they want to just muscle through it because they are frustrated that they need to slow down and take care of themselves in that more feminine way. Or they don't really know that it's happening, and that might be the worst because now you're all fighting, and if we could have just seen it coming, that might have circumvented some of that challenge. So that's my first suggestion. Arm's length and just tell the people around you. And that's free, right? Remember I said PMS on a budget. The next one is about monitoring your vices. And for the most part, things that we do for ourselves that are not particularly healthy and choices we make that are not particularly healthy do seem to worsen PMS. Whether that's alcohol, for some people, caffeine will worsen their PMS just because of the mood-related changes. Staying up too late, right? Skipping meals. All of these things are not particularly helpful for your PMS. And yet they're the very things that we sort of gravitate towards when we don't feel like ourselves. So just pay attention to that, right? You do have to parent yourself a little bit through this and be like, this might not be the night that I want to stay up late and have an extra glass of wine. I've talked about this a lot, but I'm like pretty pro abstinence from an alcohol perspective. But your brain doesn't metabolize, or your brain operates a little differently in that luteal phase from an alcohol perspective. And it probably has more mood-related symptoms in those 2 weeks than it does the other parts of the month. I generally, when I'm working with patients who really struggle with their PMS, I suggest that they eliminate it, especially during their PMS weeks, because it is a heightened impact during that time. There's lots of things that are heightened during that time, but alcohol definitely is heightened during that time. Okay, so the last two. So let's talk about exercise for a sec. The exercise hormonal stuff online makes me lose my marbles, because all of the research on exercise for PMS is positive. It doesn't matter what kind of exercise you do, you have to do some movement, and it does over time improve both the physical and the mental and emotional symptoms related to PMS. If you go online, you will generally find this discussion around when you're in your PMS phase that women are supposed to be quieter, and that means we're supposed to like lie in a quiet, dark room and not move. It's wrong. It's wrong. There's nothing else I can say. It's wrong. I'm not saying don't listen to your body, right? If you are hurt or sore, like sure, you can modify your workout, but the suggestion that we should decrease our activity during our luteal phase or during our menstrual phase is just wrong. Every single scrap of research on exercise for PMS improves it. I have a theory here though. I've done lots of looking at exercise for endometriosis, which is a pain-related condition, a pelvic pain related gynecological condition. We've talked about it before on the podcast. If you're not familiar and you have questions about that, I would just scroll back a little bit. The research on endometriosis and exercise is fascinating, and it's actually taken it one step further than the research on PMS, and I'm curious if they're actually similar. So in the endo research and in the chronic pain literature, if people with chronic pain exercise once, just one time, they feel worse. And endo's the same. If people with endometriosis exercise one time, their pelvic pain is worse from their exercise. And it's interesting because when we're exercising, we're doing a lot of things. In the short term, it's hard, right? Like in the short term, it's hard. It raises some inflammation. It does things, right? Like we're tearing down muscles, we're using up energy, we're getting depleted, quote unquote. That one session of exercise is hard. Mentally, emotionally, that one session of exercise is also hard, but repetitive exercise is actually a very different outcome. When exercise is repeated over time, people generally have less inflammation, have better stress management, and their resiliency is better, meaning that their tolerance for discomfort goes up. It means that their perception of their own pain goes down. They feel better when they exercise regularly. But if we take a person who doesn't exercise at all and we make them exercise and they get off that treadmill or off the weight machine, they feel worse. So I'm curious about this because all the research on PMS is done over time, right? There's no trials where someone exercises one time and then we say, how's your PMS? That hasn't happened yet. And arguably, I'm not sure we should run that study, but that's never happened. Whereas with the pain stuff, we do have that, right? It's an interesting contrast. All the research on PMS is regular exercise. If we're going to prescribe exercise, they have to do it 3 times per week for 12 weeks. And at the end of the 12 weeks, they feel amazeballs. We didn't ask them how they felt after one. My guess is it's a similar effect. So for you, if you exercise really infrequently, and in the pain endo literature, it's like if you exercise less than once a week and then you exercise, you're going to feel like garbage. If you exercise less than once per week and then you try and exercise during your PMS week, I'm not sure you're going to feel that much better. And that may cloud the benefit of the exercise because you're not doing it consistently enough for you to see the benefit. So every single scrap, like I said, of evidence of PMS and exercise is positive. If you have PMS, you have to start exercising. Whatever sport you like, whatever thing you like, whatever capacity is possible for you, and it probably needs to have consistency in order for you to see the benefit. Okay? Don't lie in a cold, dark room. I don't know why the room got cold now. Don't lie in a dark room, not moving because you ovulated. Most women do not hit their exercise goals based on the Canadian Cardiovascular Society or any other major society that recommends exercise for longevity. Most women don't hit that number. So please, let's not talk about decreasing our exercise for any reason because we don't do enough as it is. The last one is sleep. Go to bed. I'm gonna challenge you to think about what you do from 8 p.m. onwards. Okay. And now you might have extracurricular activities. You might have children. You might have to actually do some work during that time because maybe that's the first minute you get to yourself. But I think for most people who work on like a daytime, nighttime schedule, the things you do from 8 p.m. onwards, lots of those can go away, especially in your PMS week, and you can go to bed a little earlier. I know in the sleep discussions, we talk about consistent bedtimes. I'm talking about treatment for your horrific mood. Put yourself to bed. It's literally the greatest thing you can do for yourself. And the greatest thing you can do for the people around you probably is put yourself to bed. And that extra little bit of sleep can go a long way for improving your mood the next day. And it also just gets rid of that like most tired, most irritable version of yourself. And I know as you're listening to this, there's probably moments, if you're a big PMS struggler person, where you're like, I like need to be taken out back and like, dealt with here. If you're having that moment, like get in your bed. There's nothing wrong with going to bed early. And I definitely have at least one night per month that I go to bed in the 8s. It just happens where the collision of all the things and the fatigue and the mood and the overwhelm and everything is all coming together. It's like 7:45 and I can see that this is the night that I go to bed in the 8s. And it has probably saved us 1,000 deaths, right? It's probably saved my children from having to, be at my yelling mercy. I just go to bed. Consistent sleep and more focus on sleep in your overall health plan can have a significant impact on your PMS. And so just making that small decision to go to bed a little earlier and to give in to your fatigue when you are having a bit of a hard week can make a huge difference, and it's free. Arguably, we probably save money if we go to bed, right? Like, I don't know about you, but most of my online shopping happens before bed if I'm going to do any. I think we'd save money if we went to bed. I think this is actually a good strategy. It's our new savings plan, is just go to bed in the 8s sometimes. And that's it. So funnily, when we talk often about integrative medicine, we're usually thinking about like expensive tests, expensive supplements. And although there are supplements for PMS, right? There are some. And if you really take care of yourself and do these few free things and you realize that you're not that much better or it's still really impacting you, you should have a discussion with someone about what you can do. And I think the greatest money people can spend on their health is on strategy, because there's the cost of being wrong and trying out a bunch of crap that's not going to help, in my opinion, is way more expensive than being supported out of the get-go. But for the most part, a huge percentage of your PMS can be solved with these free things that we talked about today. And even if you decide to move forward and get support with your PMS, the actual solutions themselves are incredibly inexpensive. Like, they're almost free, the things that we prescribe for PMS. The cost there is probably in the strategy with the professional who knows PMS, who doesn't send you for stupid lab tests that you don't need, and also can help you nail it, right? And nail it with your protocol right out of the gate. That's where that big investment comes in. But for the most part, you can really get the ball rolling with some of these free things and work on your PMS with a budget of nothing. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I always like talking about hormonal health. Make sure that you have subscribed to the podcast so that you get notified on your device when new episodes are dropped. And we always love when people leave reviews and comments on their favorite podcast platform. It helps people just like you find episodes and find the podcast to begin with. And so we would love if you shared with your buddies, so that we can all feel a little better. Have a great week. I will see you next week.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. My goal is to help you feel more confident about your health. Please remember that what we talked about today in the podcast does not constitute medical advice, nor was a doctor-patient relationship formed. If you have questions about your healthcare or about how today's topic pertains to you, please take it up with your family doctor, your specialist, or someone on your health team.